Okay, so welcome back this week. Like I was saying before I turned the recording on, we're going to cover mostly knight endgames today. Just going to briefly touch on bishop endgames. And with knight endgames, I'm going to start with a bunch of different drawn positions that you might be surprised are drawn. And the first concept we're going to cover is this kind of rare case where you have knight and pawn against king that happens to be a draw. And the knight's a great piece, but one of the problems you have with the knight is that it can't triangulate. I don't know if you guys knew that. It's the only piece other than a pawn, of course, that can't triangulate. Bishops can do it, queens can do it, kings can do it, rooks can do it, except the knight. So that could be a problem in some endgames. For instance, this one. So there's no way to lose a move. So black draws here by starting with king f7. And it's important you don't play king f8, and you'll see why later. Knight c7, king f8, king f7. And there's no way that I can lose a move, so black's just going to go back and forth forever. And if you're not convinced, you can move the knight all over the board if you want. There's no way you can lose a move. Black just goes back and forth. Just for example, let's say you do something like this. You can be silly and jump all over the board, but it doesn't matter. There's no way to lose a move. Black just keeps going back and forth. So in really rare cases, even if your opponent has a knight and an extra pawn, if your opponent has a knight and a rook pawn, it might not necessarily be lost. So keep that in mind. And we're going to see another funny example of that here. Believe it or not, this position is drawn. When you have a rook pawn and a knight, if you advance it all the way to the 7th rank, as long as your opponent can control the queening square, you can't win. So, and this one is actually very useful to remember, because I'm sure it might be really tempting if you have a knight and a rook pawn, just push it down the board and assume you can win. But the problem here is black can't protect the rook pawn without stalemating the white king, so it's just a draw. Now, if black's pawn were on h3, it would be an easy win, because black could move the king to g3, play knight f2, h2, and queen. Okay. But because black's advanced it too far, there's no way to win. So this is useful to remember. Okay. And this is an example of not a drawn position, but a won position. And this is a really common kind of tactic when you have a pawn against a knight. The knight can, if it's not in front of the pawn, can be surprisingly helpless against the pawn. So here we have this double attack knight g7. Black has to take h6, and the white pawn queens by force. King f7, h7. This is a really common theme you'll see in knight endgames, where you can get a passed pawn. It's really dangerous against a knight if the knight can't get in front of it, especially rook pawns. Rook pawns can be really tricky for knights to handle. So that'll be a common theme you see in these endgames.
What you talked about last week, the king has to be outside of the square.
Yeah, and in this case, black would rather not have the knight.
Yeah.
The king would be in the square if not for that knight. So that's a theme sometimes in endgames too. Even if the king's inside the square, if there's something blocking its path, it doesn't matter. So there's also, this one is actually quite useful. This comes in handy quite a bit. This has actually personally saved me a couple games. So when your knight is against an h-pawn, in general, you don't want to protect the queening square. You want to protect some other square before it gets there. So in other words, in this case, knight g3 loses, but if white can get the knight to g4, then it's a draw. That's really useful to remember, because this will happen a lot in endgames where there's like a pawn race, and you have a knight trying to catch someone's pawn. So that's useful to remember, okay? It can be a draw if your king is close enough. If your knight's protecting the queening square, it can be a draw. But your king has to be close, and we're going to see an example of that. But yeah, in general, you want your knight to defend any other square but that square, okay? So let's just see why. So knight e3, knight g4, and believe it or not, it's a draw, because the king can harass the knight, but due to some handy forks and other things, there's no way black can make progress. Knight just goes back, then knight e3, and here's the trick. If black plays h2, you play knight f1 and pick up the pawn. And there's nothing else you can do to make progress. If king f3, just go knight back, and etc., etc. If king g2, knight e3, and so on. So that's really handy to remember. So you don't need the white king close at all if your knight can defend anything but the queenie square. It can handle the pawn all on its own. So this is a situation that you don't want. However, if you do end up here, it's useful to remember that the knight can create this kind of blockade against the king. Notice how the king can't go to e3 or d2 because if knight f1 takes h2. So black has to take a really circuitous route to get to that knight. But luckily the white's king is close enough. And this is the case, if your king is close enough, you can draw. And it's because we had this stalemate trick. Because king h1, king f2, and it's just stalemate. So the knight can't handle the pawn by itself, but if your king gets close enough, you can create a stalemate. So here's just another example of it. So white knight needs to get to the king side, so knight b4, knight c6. And if you're trying to keep a knight from getting to one side of the board, it's useful to remember this. You want to attack the knight diagonally by one square, basically. So this is best how to restrict the knight, because you control both these squares. So if you're trying to think of how to restrict just a single knight, that's the best way to do it. It's one square diagonally from it. Now fortunately for white, the knight does get there in time. And here we have the exact same position as earlier. Remember, if h2, there's knight f1, and king f3, you just go knight f1 still. So exact same position. Now another case has to do with your knight defending the pawn. So white's play here only has one way to win, and you have to put the knight behind your pawn. The point is that then if the king takes your knight, your pawn can just advance. For instance, if king g3 here, if king g3 here, king b4 draws, because if you move your knight, it takes your pawn, and if you don't move the knight, it takes your knight. So that's why here you have to play knight c4 and knight d2. And now white wins, because if you play king c3 takes d2, the pawn queens. And if you don't do that, the knight will always let you obtain the opposition, since you can waste a move with it, right? So that's useful to remember. If you have knight and pawn against the king, put your knight behind the pawn, and then you're good to go. And here's just another example of it. If you each have one pawn, then I can easily defend your own pawn, assuming it's close enough. So knight b5, then knight d6. And the problem is it takes black 2 tempi to attack your knight. So you can always gain a move moving your king closer. So if black plays king d4, doesn't help, you just move your king closer and go back, and white wins. Here's just another example of the deflecting knight sacrifice. Knight d4, bringing the knight away from the pawn, and king f6. Here we see the same idea, attacking the knight diagonally. h5, king g5, again restricting the knight. Can't play h6 yet because of knight g4, picking up the pawn. So we restrict the knight diagonally, play h6, h7, and here white wins, again because the knight was on the worst possible square guarding the queen square. And black's king isn't close enough to cause a stalemate. So king c6, you just take it, move the king out, and you win. Okay. And another useful concept, this is more abstract, but just remember that knight endgames are essentially like pawn endgames. Meaning if you're trying to evaluate it and understand who's better, just imagine the knights aren't even on the board, and that'll tell you who's better or who should be winning. So in this case, black should win this endgame because he has the outside pass pawn. Now if this were a rook endgame, that might not necessarily be the case. But because it's just knights, think of it like a king and pawn endgame, so black has the upper hand here. The specific moves don't matter too much, but the key is you slowly advance your h pawn. And the king and the knight is too much for the knight in this case. And black wins. There's no way to do anything with the knight. And if we advance, then black just plays knight c5. So it was essentially the same as a king pawn endgame here. And it's the same situation if you have like a 4 versus 3 situation. If these were rooks instead of knights, then it would be a draw in general. But on the other hand, with just knights on the board in general, this is a win for white. Okay, so just to give you an example, you can kind of see how white would win this kind of endgame. None of this is forced, but it's just showing how you might make progress here. And finally, white wins another pawn, and after that, 2-pawn advantage is too much for black. Okay, so that's good to remember. So if you have a choice between going into a 4 versus 3 with, say, rooks on the board or knights on the board, know that it's good to go with the knights. Much easier to win, and generally win, unlike the rook endgame. And here was just a little bit about bishop endgames that I wanted to cover. I'm sure a lot of you probably know this already, if not everyone here, but your bishop has to be the same color as the queening square in general. There are cases where you can cut the king off, but if the black king can reach that corner, then it's a draw. So in this case, king g8, and no way white can make progress. Black plays king h8, king g8, and the problem is you can't force the king out, and if you get too close, you're going to cause stalemate. So it's just a draw. Now, there are some tricky cases that you might think are winning. This is a good example of one. White can actually keep the black king out of the queening square, but nonetheless, it's still a draw because with just the bishop and king, white can't take the black pawn and keep the king out at the same time. And the trick here is just to make sure you keep your king in the upper half of the board. So this is a relatively common position, so it's good to remember that. If the black king moves on this 4th rank or below, then white will end up winning because white can shoulder your king away from the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th ranks that way. But as long as you keep your king on the 5th rank or higher, you're going to be able to draw. Just to show you an example of this, white can try to shoulder your king away to that side of the board, but it's a draw as long as you keep your king on that side of the board. And, white just can't make progress. Problem for white is if you just go and take a4, then the black king will follow you to the queen side. So that's a useful one to remember. And now I have some exercises for you guys to test out your knight endgame skills. Okay, so first we have white to play and win. So I didn't get this right either when I tried this. My attempt was bishop b5, but this doesn't work because of knight c5, and my idea was bishop c6, but it doesn't work. Black just takes, and if you take, there's knight a6, and the knight holds both pawns. So bishop b5 was tempting, but it doesn't work.
You play d6.
Yeah, d6 is right.
So you're sacking the pawn.
Black has to play knight takes.
Right. Then you can play something like bishop b5.
Yep. And black's in trouble because, let's say, I don't know, king f8.
Can you just take it?
Yep. And we have the same case as earlier. If knight takes b7,
Right.
a6,
Right.
and there's no way to stop a7 and a8 queen, right? Say knight c5, a7. Yeah, it doesn't matter. And black cannot take the bishop, but then you're going to either win the knight or dominate the knight. So black can play knight b5, but then, for example, a6, king e7, bishop c6. And white wins here because the knight can't move. And you just play your king over to the king side and win the pawns. Very nice. Yep. So yeah, knights are terrible against rook pawns. Important to remember. Okay. Number 2. So white to play and draw. So the first thing I want you to think about is the square of the pawn. So is your first move going to be a king move? So this is a square of the pawn. White's king is very far from it. So any king move for white is just useless here. So you can't catch it. So you're gonna be making a knight move. So you got two choices. You have a 50-50 shot of getting it right. At least on the first move, anyway.
Seems like knight g5 just plays right into h5, or knight g4, knight g6 just plays into h5.
Yeah, knight g6, h3,
Or h3,
and yeah, unfortunately, the knight's not in time. It's knight f4, h2, knight e2, king d2, knight g3, king e1, and just like the position we had before, if your knight's guarding the queening square, you're losing. Unless the king's close enough. In this case, it's not. So for example, king d6, just king f2. If knight e4, king g2 shoulders the knight out. Again, one square diagonally from the knight. And finally, if you play knight h1, just king g2. And the white king is one tempo short of stalemating. So black wins. So yeah, knight g6 doesn't work. So that means we have to play knight f7, right? Okay, h3. So now what?
Yeah, so you gotta play like knight g5.
Yeah, knight g5,
And then
h2.
check the king.
Knight e4 is forced.
Yeah.
And I don't know, let's say king d3 and knight g3. Right? Yeah, you wouldn't want to play knight f2. The point of playing knight g3 is, again, all these squares are mined. Black can't move to e4, e2, literally, but king e3 runs at knight f1. So now that you set up this barrier, black has to take the long way around, so you have enough time to stalemate black. So in this case, king d2, move your king closer, and your king is in time. In this case, to even guard the knight. So it ends up being a draw. But we won that single tempo by being able to check the black king on the way to g3.
It's the only way to stop the promotion, yeah.
Yep. Just what's that? You can do what?
You can just take the pawn
If they go d2.
Yeah, or you can just take
Oh, if they go king d2?
yeah.
Yeah, if they go king d2, you go knight f3. Oh, is that the route I took? Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, it doesn't matter in either case. If they go king d4, you have the same situation. Well, actually, in this case, you shoulder out the black king from e5. Yep. Okay. So, white to play and win. So this is just another example, by the way, of how knight Endgames are like king and pawn Endgames, in that it matters more how far advanced your passed pawns are, the quality of them, than how many you have. Black has two connected passers, but it doesn't matter because white's is further advanced. So white to play and win. Okay, you want knight f6, now knight c6.
Might be some.
What's that? And if you play g7, black plays knight e7. And yeah, you can win the black knight, but you're not going to win the game because after takes, knight takes, black plays b4. And there's no way for you to win because black's going to put the king on d4. And your knight's not going to be able to move away from the defense of your e4 pawn ever. For example, knight f6, say king b5. There's not much you can do. Let's say knight d7, you go after the e5 pawn. Doesn't matter. There's no way you can defend e4. Yeah. Alright. Someone said knight e7?
Yeah.
Yeah. So knight e7. Okay, so you're threatening g7, g8. Black has to move the knight closer. So knight d7. So now what? Knight c6, good. King has to go to b6.
Yeah. Take on E5.
Very nice. Knight can't take because of g7. So knight f6.
Oh, E7.
So if g7, black can play.
D7.
Oh, knight d7. Sorry. Yeah, that's correct. Knight takes. Now.
Then lose. E5. 1.
E5 is correct. Yeah. And the knight has no way to stop the g pawn. If knight f8, g7, and if knight e5, again the knight can't defend the queening square, just g7. Good job. Yeah, that's a tricky one. But yeah, using those forks to divert the knight is a very common theme in these endgames. Okay. White's playing win. So again, white's down a pawn, yet winning. You'll notice this is a theme. Again, it's just more important that white's pawns are further advanced. What's that? So 95 is the right idea, but the knight gets too close to the king. Knight takes. What was your idea here? So king takes b6. I think it's a little too slow. h4. And if a5, now h3. Yeah, h3 guards the queening square, right? And you can't queen. But it doesn't matter much either, because if you play instead a5, similar idea, black can just take and play h4. Problem is b7 doesn't threaten anything, because if you queen, black has this fork. So yeah, at the very beginning, you need to play knight d2, because the knight gets further away from the king. So knight takes d2.
Alright, what is it then? Queen takes. All
The
the king takes
A5.
one, or is it h5?
Yeah, you want to choose whichever move queens faster. So yeah, the problem with king takes b6 is you have to then move your king out of the way. Yeah. So a5 is faster. Black needs to take basically. Now b6. Now black can try to be sneaky with the knight, getting it back there. Black can play knight c4. You have to play b7. Now knight e5.
Oh, that fork again.
Yeah.
But you just play.
Now it gets tricky though. White has only one move that wins.
King A8.
So king a8 runs into knight c6, and you're stalemated. You got a queen. Yeah. So king b6 leads to a draw.
No, not even knight e7, just play like h4. And then if you ever promote, you got that fork.
Well, I think if h4 you have king c7, but I think
Oh,
black
king
can
C7,
play.
okay.
I think black can play knight d7 and draw. Because now if king c7, you have knight c5, and if you queen, there's knight a6. And if king c6, there's just knight b8. And unfortunately, the knight just chases you around. If king c7, knight a6, back and forth, there's no way to make progress. So anyway. So white's playing win.
So is it the king a6?
If king a6, I think knight d7.
Oh, that just stops everything.
Yeah.
And you can't triangulate. Oh no, because black will trade and win.
Yep.
So they had one move left.
I was gonna mention.
King b8.
Yeah. So king b8. So king b8 turns out to be the win. And the whole point is here your king avoids some of those squares where the knight can just fork you. So black has to move the knight, because if you play h4, king c7, and white queens first, remember attacking the knight diagonally. So let's check him. Knight c7. Now not king c7 because knight c5 draws like we said before, but king c8 wins. Because now knight c5 we can queen without getting forked. And if knight b6, just king d8. And there's no way to guard the b8 square. So knight d7 doesn't work, and if knight c6, you can just play king c7. And there's no way to move the knight anywhere where you can fork white. If you play knight b4, just king b6, knight d5, king c5, and white wins. For instance, knight b4, king b5, and there's no way to stop b8 queen. So this one is black to play and win. So one of the things we looked at last week was the breakthrough, right? When you have a pawn mass, you try to make a pass pawn. So this is same concept here. And this is a really common kind of thing you'll see in knight games, because again, a knight fighting, especially a pass rook pawn, hint hint, is difficult.
Knight c3.
Yep.
Yeah, I
And
saw that, but what about if knight takes?
well, if knight takes, d
Pawn
takes,
takes.
and then if pawn takes, you have
Oh, then you
a4.
have that same idea. Okay.
Yep.
So, knight c3.
The outside pass pawn is deadly. And it doesn't matter if white plays b takes either. D takes,
Right.
and if you play knight takes, how does black play here? Or I'm sorry, you don't want to take. You want to play a4. I'm sorry. And there's no way to stop the a pawn, because if you play cd, just cd, and ba. There's no way to stop that pawn. It's too slow. Knight d3, a2, and you queen. Yeah, even though the pawn is 3 moves away from queening, the knight still can't cash it. So any questions on this endgame? Okay, and by the way, any requests for next time? Any endgames specifically?
Well, on the plus side, we'll have some games to analyze.
Yeah, hopefully next week you guys will record all your games thoroughly, right? That is an important part of improving, by the way. I mean, the quote-unquote Botvinnik School of Chess is pretty simple. It's play games, and like long time control games, and annotate them yourself, analyze them, and that's most of what the Botvinnik School taught, by the way. So it's not rocket science. But even though it's simple, it's not easy. If that makes any sense. Okay. That's all I had for today.